The morning it all ended started the same way it always does in Cedarbrook Estates. Sprinklers, birdsong, the smell of someone's coffee drifting through a screen door left open just wide enough to let in the September air. And then tires. 3 Maricopa County Sheriff's Department cruisers rolled into the cul-de-sac at 7:14 in the morning, followed by 2 unmarked black sedans and a white van with the Arizona Attorney General's seal stenciled on the passenger door. Gerald Whitmore III stepped out of his front door in a burgundy silk robe and tan leather slippers, a ceramic mug of French press coffee in his hand, a look on his face that said he had never once in his 49 years been surprised by anything. He was about to be surprised. Across the street on the front porch of a well-kept beige colonial with a small American flag mounted beside the door, a woman sat in a rocking chair. She held her own mug, black coffee, no sugar. She watched the cruisers park. She watched the deputies climb out. She did not smile. She did not wave. She simply watched, the way a person watches something they planned for a very long time finally arrive exactly on schedule. Her name was Staff Sergeant Renata Delgado Pierce, United States Marine Corps, retired. And she had been waiting for this morning for 14 months. Let me tell you about Cedarbrook Estates. It sits at the edge of Chandler, Arizona, a Phoenix suburb that managed, somehow, to hold onto its small-town feeling even as the city swelled around it. Cedarbrook Estates was developed in the late 1990s, 42 single-family homes arranged around 3 quiet streets and 1 long cul-de-sac called Ironwood Circle. The houses were built with terracotta roof tiles and desert landscaping, purple sage, red gravel, barrel cactus. The kind of neighborhood where people still knew their neighbors' names and their dogs' names too. Where Halloween meant actual kids in actual costumes walking door to door, not just a school party. Where somebody always watered your plants when you were out of town and nobody asked to be thanked. In the summer of 2021, Cedarbrook Estates was the kind of place that still worked the way neighborhoods were supposed to work. There was Jim and Dolores Pacheco at number 4, retired teachers who grew tomatoes in raised beds along their east wall. There was Ben Ackafer, a soft-spoken nurse who drove nights at Chandler Regional and kept a vegetable garden that rivaled the Pachecos. There was elderly Margaret Chabot at number 11, who had lived in her house since 1999 and left a small dish of water out for stray cats every single morning. And at number 7, Ironwood Circle, there was Renata. She had moved in 8 years before in 2013. She bought the place with cash, or close enough to cash that the transaction was clean and quick. She planted desert willow trees along her south wall. She hung wind chimes on her back porch. She adopted a rescue greyhound named Corporal CPL, for short, who was tall and quiet and elegant and spent most of his time sleeping in a patch of morning sun near the front window. Cedarbrook Estates in the summer of 2021 was quiet and good. And then, on the 3rd of July, a moving truck turned onto Ironwood Circle. Staff Sergeant Renata Delgado Pierce was 41 years old when Gerald Whitmore moved in across the street. She was born in Tucson, the second of 4 children of a Mexican-American electrician and a Filipino-American nurse. She enlisted in the United States Marine Corps at age 18 in 1998 after 2 years of community college and a very clear-eyed understanding of what she wanted from her life: discipline, structure, purpose. She got all 3. Over 19 years of service, Renata deployed to Iraq twice, first in 2003 during the initial invasion, then again in 2005 as part of the surge operations in Anbar Province. She served with the 1st Marine Logistics Group out of Camp Pendleton, then with Marine Forces Reserve in Phoenix. She was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat V device for her actions during a convoy ambush outside Fallujah in November 2005, the details of which she rarely discussed and never exaggerated. She was the kind of person who did the hard thing before anyone had to ask her to do it. She retired in 2017 with a full pension and a shoulder that would never quite heal right from a fall down a cargo ramp in Kuwait. She had reconstructive surgery. She did 2 years of physical therapy. She learned, slowly and with great stubbornness, to adapt. In Chandler, she worked part-time as a logistics consultant for a regional construction firm. She ran 3 miles every morning at 5:30 a.m., bad shoulder and all. She volunteered on weekends at a veterans peer support group at the Carl T. Hayden VA Medical Center in Phoenix. She was not what anyone would call loud. She kept her lawn immaculate. She waved to neighbors. She brought Margaret Chabot's groceries up from the curb on weeks when the old woman's arthritis was bad. But there was something about Renata Delgado Pierce that the people who knew her understood instinctively. She was patient in the way that only people who have been truly tested are patient. She could wait. She could absorb. She could endure. And she kept records. Her filing cabinet, a heavy olive green 4-drawer metal unit she'd dragged from a surplus sale at Luke Air Force Base, was organized by year, then by month, then by category. Every receipt, every document, every lease and deed and utility correspondence. She had started keeping records in 2003 in Iraq. The habit never left her. The one wound she carried that never showed up on any medical form was simpler than shrapnel or a bad shoulder. She was alone. Not lonely exactly, she would correct anyone who said that, but alone. Her marriage to Kevin Pierce, a Marine staff sergeant she met at Camp Pendleton, had lasted 4 years before the deployments pulled it apart. They parted without bitterness. They still exchanged cards on birthdays, but that chapter had closed, and Renata had never opened another one quite like it. She had CPL, the Greyhound, she had her neighbors, she had her work. It was enough. Until the moving truck arrived. The truck was a large white Mayflower, the biggest residential rig, the kind that suggests either a great many possessions or a great deal of self-regard. It arrived at 7 a.m. on July 3, 2021, and was followed by a pearl-white 2020 Cadillac Escalade with custom brushed chrome rims and a vanity plate that read, GWHIT3. Gerald Whitmore III was 49 years old. He was 6'1", with the build of a man who had played lacrosse in college and never entirely stopped believing it mattered. He had grown up wealthy. His grandfather had built a mid-size commercial real estate empire in Scottsdale, and Gerald had inherited enough of it to never need to work particularly hard. He managed a portion of the family holdings through an LLC called Whitmore Equity Partners, which mostly meant he attended meetings, signed documents, and had lunch with other men in sport coats. He had lived in a gated community in Paradise Valley for most of the past decade, but a bitter divorce 2 years prior had reshuffled his finances enough that Cedarbrook Estates, a perfectly fine, upper-middle-class suburb, was now the right-sized fit. He did not see it that way. Within 20 minutes of the moving truck's arrival, he had already walked across the street to introduce himself to Jim Pacheco in a way that was technically an introduction, but actually more of an assessment. "Nice enough block," Gerald said, surveying the cul-de-sac with his hands in his pockets, the way a man surveys something he's considering purchasing. "Little tight, but it'll do for now." Jim Pacheco, who had lived on that street for 16 years, smiled and said nothing. Gerald noticed the wind chimes on Renata's porch across the street. He frowned slightly. "Those things run all day." "Depends on the breeze," Jim said. Gerald nodded slowly, not the nod of a man accepting information, the nod of a man making a mental note. 3 days after moving in, Gerald Whitmore attended his first Cedarbrook Estates HOA meeting. 2 months later, he had been elected president. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone walk into a space that was already working just fine and immediately start trying to run it? Drop a comment. Tell me if you've met a Gerald. I think a lot of you have. Gerald ran for HOA president on a platform of what he called community standards and property value protection. He brought a printed slide deck to the candidate forum. He wore a button-down shirt. He talked about curb appeal metrics and noise ordinance compliance and the need for consistent enforcement. He won by 8 votes, mostly because the previous president, a retired schoolteacher named Ron Aguilar, had been in the role for 11 years and was relieved to step down. The first thing Gerald did as HOA president in October 2021 was send a formal written notice to Renata Delgado Pierce at 7 Ironwood Circle. The subject line read, "Wind chimes, violation of Section 4(7)B, Community Noise and Nuisance Standards." Renata read the notice on a Tuesday afternoon, standing at her kitchen counter with CPL, arranged across her feet like a warm rug. She read it twice. The notice cited Section 4(7)(b) of the Cedarbrook Estates HOA Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, the CC&RS, which prohibited persistent mechanical or tonal sound-generating devices in front-facing exterior areas of the home during the hours of 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. without prior board approval. Wind chimes, according to Gerald Whitmore III, were a persistent tonal sound-generating device. Renata pulled out her copy of the CC&RS. She had read them before buying the house and looked up Section 4(7)(b). It existed, it was real. It was also, she noted, written in 1998, had never been enforced in the 23 years since, and included a grandfather clause for decorative items installed prior to the adoption of any new board interpretation. Her wind chimes had been on that porch since 2014. She also noted something else, something small, something she filed away. The CC&RS required that any noise complaint be accompanied by a written statement from at least 2 additional homeowners on the affected block confirming they had also experienced the nuisance. Gerald's notice had no such statements attached. Renata put on a light jacket. October in Chandler still carried warmth in the afternoons, but the evenings were beginning to cool, and walked across the street. She knocked on Gerald Whitmore's door at 5:15 p.m. He answered in slacks and a collared shirt, still in work mode, phone in hand. He looked at her the way some people look at a minor inconvenience that has chosen to present itself at an inconvenient time. "Ms. Delgado," he said. He dropped the Pierce. "Staff Sergeant Delgado Pierce," she said pleasantly. "I got your notice." "Good, then you understand the situation." "I do," she said. "I also understand that section requires 2 additional homeowner complaints to initiate a notice of violation. I don't see those attached." A pause. Gerald tilted his head slightly. "Board discretion allows preliminary notice." "Can you point me to that provision?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'll follow up in writing," he said. "I'd appreciate that," Renata said. She held out her hand. He shook it briefly, the handshake of a man who didn't want to. "Have a good evening," she said. She walked back across the street, went inside, and wrote the date and time in a small brown leather notebook she kept in the top left drawer of her filing cabinet. October 19, 2021, 5:15 p.m. First contact. No CC&R provision cited for board discretion. No supporting complaints attached to notice. Gerald Whitmore III, HOA President, 8 Ironwood Circle. She also that same evening pulled out the small security camera she'd bought 2 years prior for her back porch. She'd never installed the second unit, and mounted it above her front door, angled toward the street. She did it quietly, without announcement, without any particular urgency. It was simply the right thing to do. She had learned, a long time ago, that documentation was armor. Gerald's follow-up letter arrived 11 days later. It cited board president authority to issue preliminary notices as a courtesy prior to formal complaint filing. It did not cite any specific CC&R provision because no such provision existed. It also informed Renata that she had 30 days to remove the wind chimes or face a formal violation, a $150 fine, and potential further action. Renata responded in writing, certified mail, return receipt requested. Her letter was 4 paragraphs. It was polite. It cited 3 specific sections of the CC&RS. It requested the board hold a formal meeting to discuss the matter, as required by the governing documents for any fine exceeding $100. It closed with, "I look forward to resolving this matter in accordance with our community's established procedures." Gerald did not respond. Instead, the escalation began. In November 2021, Renata received a second notice, this one for her desert willow trees. According to Gerald, 2 of the trees extended branches over the property line onto the HOA's shared easement strip along Ironwood Circle by approximately 4 inches. Violation of Section 6.2, encroachment on common areas. Fine, $200. Renata measured the branches herself with a tape measure. One extended 3.5 inches. The other 2, she photographed both with a ruler in frame. She pruned both trees that weekend. She did not pay the fine. She wrote another certified letter noting that the corrective action had been completed within 7 days, well within the 30-day cure period, and that per Section 6(2)(c), fines were not assessed when violations were cured within the remedy window. She was right. Gerald knew she was right. The fine was quietly dropped. In December, the violations accelerated. A notice for CPL's water dish on the front porch, unapproved exterior fixture. A notice for a small clay pot of pansies beside her front step, non-approved plant species in the front yard zone. A notice that her recycling bin was placed at the curb at 6:45 a.m. on a Tuesday. Collection day staging must not occur before 7 a.m. 15 minutes early, he had photographed it, time-stamped. Renata documented everything: dates, responses, certified mail tracking numbers. Her brown leather notebook grew dense with entries. She also in December called the Maricopa County Recorder's Office and requested a copy of the original HOA CC and RS as recorded in 1998, along with all recorded amendments. What she received was interesting. She put it in her filing cabinet, said nothing. In January 2022, Gerald made his first move against her with the city. He filed a noise complaint with the City of Chandler Code Enforcement, claiming that Renata's wind chimes, which she had never removed because she had never been properly fined for them under HOA procedure, constituted a violation of Chandler City Code Section 47(9), residential noise nuisance. A code enforcement officer named Travis Hollies arrived at her door on a Thursday morning. He was young, friendly, clearly a little uncomfortable. He explained the complaint. He listened while Renata explained the CC and R situation, showed him her correspondence file, and pointed out that the city ordinance defined a noise nuisance as sounds exceeding 55 decibels at the property line between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. She mentioned, purchased a decibel meter in November. She showed him the readings. Wind chimes on a calm day, 38-44 decibels. On a windy day, 48 at maximum. The city threshold was 55. Travis Hollies closed his notebook. "I'll note the complaint was investigated and found to be without basis," he said. "Thank you," Renata said. "Would you like a copy of the readings for your file?" He said yes. She gave him a printed sheet she had already prepared. She wrote that in her notebook too. And then, on the night of February 8, 2022, Gerald crossed a different kind of line. It was a cold night for Chandler, 38 degrees, the kind of dry desert cold that cuts through a jacket sideways. Renata had gone to bed early. She ran at 5:30. She was usually in bed by 10. At 2:17 a.m., CPL got up from his sleeping spot beside the bed. He was old for a greyhound, 9 years, and he rarely moved at night unless something disturbed him. He padded to the front window and stood there, looking out. Renata woke at the sound of his nails on the hardwood. She lay still for a moment, listening, then she heard it, a car idling, then a door, then footsteps on gravel. She got up. She did not turn on any lights. She moved to the front window and looked out through the edge of the curtain, the way she had learned to look at things in places where looking directly was a risk. A figure, dark jacket, moving along the front of her property between the sidewalk and her desert willow trees. The figure crouched. There was a small flame, a lighter, and then movement, and then the figure was back to the car and gone. The car was a pearl-white Cadillac Escalade. Renata stood at the window for a long moment. Then she put on her boots and her jacket and went outside. The desert willow on the left side of her front yard, the one she had planted in 2013, the one that bloomed pink every spring, the one she had pruned to satisfy Gerald Whitmore's encroachment complaint, had been cut. Not trimmed, cut. The main trunk, about 4 inches in diameter, severed with something heavy close to the base. The tree was still standing, barely, held up by its own weight, leaning against the property stake. At the base of the cut there was scorching. Someone had tried to burn it. The flame hadn't caught well in the cold, dry air, but the base was charred. The tree was not going to survive. Renata crouched beside it for a long moment. She did not make a sound. She put one hand on the bark, still slightly warm from whatever accelerant they had used. She stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds. Then she stood up, went inside, got her phone. The front door camera had captured everything. The timestamp, the figure, the Escalade, the license plate GWHIT3, perfectly visible under the streetlight at 2:17 a.m. She uploaded the footage to a cloud drive. She photographed the tree from 6 angles. She measured the cut. She bagged a small sample of the debris at the base in a Ziploc bag. She called the Chandler Police non-emergency line at 2:48 a.m. An officer arrived at 3:20. He filed a report. He took her footage on a thumb drive. He photographed the tree. Case number CPD 202220744. Then Renata went inside, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table in the dark. If you think Renata was going to let this go, you don't yet understand what kind of woman she is. She didn't rage, she didn't go across the street and pound on Gerald's door, she didn't post anything on social media, she didn't call anyone. She sat with it, the way she had learned in 2 deployments and 19 years of service to sit with hard things without letting the hardness break her. She was quiet for a very long time. And then she opened her filing cabinet. Here's what nobody knew at the time. Renata Delgado Pierce had not spent her entire Marine Corps career in logistics. From 2009 to 2013, the last 4 years of her service, she had been attached to the Marine Corps Legal Services Support Section out of Camp Pendleton. She had been trained as a legal clerk, then as a paralegal specialist. She had spent 4 years working directly with Judge Advocate General officers, processing courts-martial, drafting legal correspondence, and learning in granular procedural detail how institutions work, how violations are documented, and how cases are built. She was not a lawyer, she had never claimed to be. But she knew how lawyers think, she knew how evidence is gathered, she knew the difference between what feels like a crime and what can be proven as one. She had known since October that Gerald Whitmore was going to make a mistake. People like him always did. Entitled people, people who had never faced real consequences, couldn't help themselves. They escalated. They got sloppy. She had simply been waiting. Now she had the footage, she had the tree, she had the police report. But she also had something else. Remember the documents she had requested from the Maricopa County Recorder's Office in December. Here's what those documents showed. The Cedarbrook Estates HOA had been incorporated in 1997 and registered its original CC and RS in 1998. Those CC and RS had been amended twice, once in 2004 and once in 2011, both times by homeowner vote with proper notice, as required by Arizona law. Gerald Whitmore, however, had sent Renata notices citing violations from what he called the 2020 Revised Community Standards Addendum. Renata had looked for that addendum in the county records. It wasn't there. It had never been recorded. It had never been voted on. It had never been distributed to homeowners for review, as required by Arizona Revised Statutes Section 331803, the law governing HOA rule amendments in the state. Gerald had fabricated it. Or, to be more precise, he had written a new document, stamped it with the HOA seal he controlled as president, and begun enforcing it as if it were legally binding, without ever submitting it to a homeowner vote, without ever recording it with the county, without ever notifying residents. Every fine he had issued, every violation notice, everything citing the 2020 Revised Community Standards Addendum. All of it was legally void. And if it was legally void, then the fees he had collected from other homeowners under those provisions. Renata had spoken very carefully with Jim Pacheco and with Ben Ockhaffer and with 3 other neighbors, amounted to the collection of money under false pretense. That had a legal name. In Arizona, it was called fraudulent misrepresentation. And when it involved an HOA, a quasi-governmental body granted authority by the state, it could also trigger violations of Arizona's Planned Community Act with civil penalties up to $500 per violation. Renata had counted 17 separate homeowners who had paid fines under the fraudulent addendum. She had the amounts. She had the dates. She had the receipts because she had simply asked her neighbors, most of whom were confused and relieved that someone was finally looking into it. Total collected $14,300. She had also, by February 2022, done something else. She had looked up Gerald Whitmore III's business registration for Whitmore Equity Partners, LLC. She had searched the Maricopa County Assessor's records. She had found that Whitmore Equity Partners held liens on 2 commercial properties in the Phoenix metro area that were currently in active dispute with the Arizona Department of Revenue for unpaid business taxes. She printed every page, filed it. And then she made a phone call to someone she had worked with at Camp Pendleton, a retired JAG officer named Colonel Rhett, Diane Essery, who now ran a private legal practice in Scottsdale specializing in HOA and real estate law. Diane, Renata said, I need about an hour of your time. I think I have something. Diane Essery cleared her calendar. Renata, she said, 2 hours into their meeting, looking at the documents spread across her conference table. This is extraordinary. I know, Renata said. The vandalism alone is criminal, but this, Diane tapped the unrecorded addendum, this is fraud, HOA fraud under Arizona statute, and with the tax issues, the AG's office is going to want to know about this. That's why I'm here, Renata said. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where you realized that the person who had been picking on you didn't know who they were picking on? I want you to think about that moment, and I want you to drop it in the comments, because I think what happens next is going to feel very familiar. Diane Essery filed a complaint with the Arizona Attorney General's Office, Consumer Protection Division, in February 2022. She filed a civil suit against Gerald Whitmore III personally and against the Cedarbrook Estates HOA board on behalf of Renata and 16 other named homeowners in Maricopa County Superior Court. She also filed a criminal vandalism and destruction of property complaint with the Chandler Police Department, supplementing Renata's original report with the additional video analysis and a sworn statement. The civil complaint included fraudulent enforcement of unrecorded HOA rules in violation of ARS 331-803, collection of funds under false pretense, criminal destruction of property, the desert willow tree, valued by an arborist at $2,200 for replacement and $4,000 for loss of established landscaping value. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Abuse of HOA authority. Total damages sought $218,500 plus attorney fees plus punitive damages. The Arizona Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division opened its own independent investigation in March 2022. And Renata went back to her daily life. She ran her 3 miles at 5:30 a.m. She took CPL on his evening walk. She brought Margaret Chabot's groceries up from the curb. She did not say a word to Gerald Whitmore. She didn't need to. It was a Tuesday morning in September 2022. The kind of September morning in Chandler where the heat has finally broken and the air is clean, and the sky is the particular deep blue that makes people understand why anyone would choose to live in the desert. 6:58 a.m. The sprinklers on Jim Pacheco's lawn were doing their slow rotations. A roadrunner was moving along the far edge of the cul-de-sac with the brisk, important energy roadrunners always seem to have. At 7:00 a.m. exactly, 3 Maricopa County Sheriff's Department cruisers turned onto Ironwood Circle. Behind them, 2 unmarked black sedans. Behind those, the white van from the Arizona Attorney General's office. Renata was already on her porch. She had been up since 5. She was wearing clean jeans, a gray Marine Corps Logistics Group sweatshirt, and her good boots. She had made coffee, a full pot, because she had suspected it might be that kind of morning. CPL was stretched across the porch planks beside her rocking chair, his long greyhound legs extended, unbothered. Gerald Whitmore came out of his front door at 7:06. Burgundy silk robe, tan slippers, coffee mug. He looked at the vehicles on the street the way people look at something that must be for someone else. There were 5 of them. 5 official vehicles, 7 uniformed deputies, 3 plainclothes investigators from the AG's office, and a woman in a charcoal business suit whom Renata recognized as Assistant Attorney General Patricia Vance, who had been assigned to lead the consumer fraud investigation. Two Maricopa County deputies walked up Gerald's driveway. "Gerald Whitmore III," the lead deputy said. "Yes," Gerald said slowly. "Sir, I have a warrant for your arrest on 2 counts of criminal vandalism, 1 count of fraudulent misrepresentation, and 1 count of obtaining money under false pretense in violation of Arizona Revised Statute 132310. He held out the warrant. "I also have a civil process service from Maricopa County Superior Court." A second deputy held out a thick envelope. Gerald stood there, the coffee mug was still in his hand. He looked at the warrant, he looked at the deputies, he looked very slowly across the street. Renata met his eyes, she took a sip of coffee. She did not smile, she did not wave, she looked at him the way a person looks at something they have already finished processing. "Sir, please set your coffee down and place your hands behind your back." The sound of handcuffs in the quiet morning air carried all the way to Margaret Chabot's front step, where the old woman had come outside with her small dish of water for the cats and was now standing very still. Jim and Dolores Pacheco had appeared on their porch. Ben Ockhaffer, just back from a night shift, sat in his car in his driveway and watched through the windshield. Simultaneously, an HOA process server presented the civil suit to the Whitmore address for service of record. An AG investigator carried a box of subpoenaed documents from the HOA's administrative files, including Gerald's own personal computer, taken under warrant, which contained a folder labeled simply, Addendum Draft 2020. The document he had fabricated, on his own machine, with his edits visible in the file's metadata, timestamped to April 2021, 2 months before he had even moved into Cedarbrook Estates. He had written the fake rules before he arrived. He had always planned to enforce them. The AG's investigation would later determine that Gerald Whitmore had used a near-identical scheme at a previous HOA he had briefly controlled in Tempe in 2018, collecting $9,400 in fraudulent fines before homeowners there had simply voted him off the board without ever realizing the fraud. Chandler was supposed to be the second act. Gerald Whitmore III was placed in the back of a sheriff's department cruiser at 7:19 a.m. He did not look back at the house, he did not look across the street. The pearl-white 2020 Cadillac Escalade sat in the driveway, the custom brushed chrome rims catching the morning sun, GWHIT 3 facing outward. And here's what I want you to think about, folks. The man spent 14 months sending violation notices for wind chimes that registered 38 decibels. Wind chimes. He sent 9 formal letters. He filed a city code complaint. He had a tree cut down at 2 in the morning. He spent more time and energy trying to run one woman out of her home than most people spend on anything. And he had never, not once, considered that she was keeping records. Ironwood Circle was quiet after the cruisers left. The kind of quiet that follows something significant. Not the comfortable quiet of a normal morning, but the held-breath quiet of people processing what they have just witnessed. Jim Pacheco walked across the street. He stood at the base of Renata's porch steps. He looked up at her. "You okay?" he said. "Yeah," she said. "You want coffee?" He said yes. She went inside and got him a mug. They sat on the porch together, Jim on the step, Renata in her rocker, and drank coffee and watched the Roadrunner make another pass across the far end of the cul-de-sac. Ben Ockhaffer came by an hour later, then Margaret Chabot's daughter who had come to help her mother understand what had happened. Then a woman named Cora Tran from number 14 who had paid $400 in fraudulent fines and had been too intimidated to complain. They stood in Renata's front yard in the September morning, talking quietly. Nobody had a party, nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of neighborhood. It was the kind of neighborhood where people brought casseroles and sat on porches and talked, and that's what they did. Gerald Whitmore III was released on bond that same afternoon. He returned to his house. He did not come outside. His attorney, retained within 2 hours of the arrest, issued a statement describing the charges as a mischaracterization of HOA administrative procedures, and promised that Gerald would be fully vindicated. That statement was not widely believed. Over the next several weeks, as the civil suit became public record and local Phoenix news outlets picked up the story, Gerald Whitmore found that his phone calls were not being returned by the people in his industry who had previously returned them. Commercial real estate is a relationship business. It runs on reputation, and Gerald's reputation was now searchable. In November 2022, Gerald's attorney notified Diane Essery's office that his client wished to discuss settlement. The negotiation lasted 3 weeks. Nobody on Ironwood Circle waved to Gerald Whitmore during those weeks. Nobody was rude. Nobody confronted him. They simply lived their lives the way they always had and did not include him in them. The moving truck came on a Wednesday in December. Cold, gray, the kind of day when the desert feels less like paradise and more like a very large empty place. Nobody watched from their porches. Nobody waved. The Escalade with the GWHIT3 plate followed the truck out of the cul-de-sac and did not come back. The civil case settled in January 2023. Gerald Whitmore III paid $312,000, the largest component being attorney fees, followed by the return of all fraudulent fines collected from 17 homeowners with treble damages applied under Arizona Consumer Fraud Statute, followed by compensation for Renata's destroyed tree and documented emotional damages. The criminal case proceeded separately. Gerald pleaded no contest to 1 count of fraudulent misrepresentation and 1 count of criminal vandalism in April 2023. He received 3 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and a formal bar from serving in any HOA governance role in the state of Arizona for 10 years. Whitmore Equity Partners LLC surrendered to dissolution in June 2023, following the Arizona Department of Revenue's collection action on the outstanding business tax debts. As for Gerald himself, the last public record of him in the Phoenix metro area is a rental agreement in Glendale, filed in late 2023. No HOA, no Cadillac on the registration, no vanity plate. On Ironwood Circle, things settled back into what they had always been. Cora Tran, who had been afraid to speak up for 14 months, organized a block dinner in the spring. Long tables in the cul-de-sac, string lights, people bringing dishes from their own cultures. Jim Pacheco brought his mother's tamales. Ben Acaffer brought jollof rice. Margaret Shabo, 81 years old and fiercer than anyone gave her credit for, brought a potato soup that disappeared in 20 minutes. Renata brought a cooler of drinks and let CPL roam the perimeter with great dignity. The house at 8 Ironwood Circle sold in March 2023 to a retired schoolteacher from Flagstaff named Andrew Whitfield and his wife, Connie, who grew succulents and kept a bird feeder. Andrew was soft-spoken and shook hands firmly and asked Jim Pacheco on his first weekend where the best breakfast place in Chandler was. He was, by all accounts, an excellent neighbor. And in the spring of 2023, about 10 months after a Cadillac with chrome rims had last sat in the driveway across the street, the desert willow in Renata's front yard bloomed. Not the old one, that one was gone. But in the fall, after the criminal case had concluded, Renata had planted a new one, a young tree, smaller, pale branches, the particular dusty green of desert plants that know they are in for something hard. It bloomed pink in March, small flowers delicate as tissue paper trembling in the morning air. CPL lay in the morning sun near the front window and watched it. And the wind chimes sang. You know, folks, I've told a lot of stories on this channel. Stories about people who thought they were the most powerful person on the block. People who confused the authority they had borrowed, an HOA presidency, a title, a bank account, with the kind of authority that actually means something. And here's what I keep coming back to. Real strength is quiet. It doesn't need an announcement. It doesn't need a silk robe or a custom plate or a stack of violation notices. Real strength looks like a woman who spent 19 years serving her country, who came home and planted a tree and hung wind chimes and kept records and waited patiently, methodically, completely, for the truth to arrive in its own time. It always does. Gerald Whitmore thought he understood power, he understood money maybe, he understood bluster, he understood how to intimidate people who didn't know the rules as well as he did. What he didn't understand was Renata Delgado Pierce. He didn't understand that she had trained for years to function clearly under pressure, that she had been in places where the stakes were infinitely higher than a violation notice for wind chimes, and she had come home from those places with her judgment intact, that she had learned, in ways that can't be taught in any classroom, how to be patient. He made the oldest mistake that entitled people make. He confused her silence for weakness. He assumed that because she didn't fight back the way he expected, loudly, emotionally, reactively, she wasn't fighting back at all. She was keeping records. And so I'll leave you with this the same way I always do. If you're in a situation right now where someone is treating you unfairly in your neighborhood, in your workplace, in your life, and you're tempted to blow up, to react, to match their energy with your own, don't. Document, date, photograph, certify. And wait. Because the thing about people who abuse power is that they never stop at one. They keep going, they keep pushing, they get sloppy. And when they do, and they always do, you'll be ready. Never mistake a quiet person for a passive one. Never mistake documentation for weakness. And never, ever pick a fight with a veteran who has already survived things that would have broken most people and came home knowing exactly how to win. Thank you for watching. If this story hit close to home, I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me about your neighbor. Tell me about your Gerald. Tell me how you handled it or how you're still handling it. You might be surprised how many people in this community have been exactly where you are. And if someone out there needs to hear this today, share it. Because sometimes the most important thing we can do for each other is simply say, I see what they're doing to you, and I know it's going to be okay. This story is inspired by real events and public court records. Names, locations, and specific details have been changed or dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental.